The late afternoon sun bathed the city park in gold, casting long shadows across the grass. A warm breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional laughter of children playing nearby. It was a rare moment of stillness in a world that never seemed to slow down. Brielle Hayes let out a deep breath as she turned a page in her book, savoring the quiet. It had been a grueling week at the law firm, long nights, endless case files, and the ever-present weight of being a Black woman in a field that demanded twice the effort for half the recognition. She had fought tooth and nail to be where she was, a respected attorney known for her sharp intellect and relentless pursuit of justice. And yet, here she was, simply reading on a park bench, when the approaching footsteps sent a chill down her spine. "Ma'am." The voice was sharp, authoritative. She looked up from her book to find two uniformed police officers standing over her. One was tall, broad-shouldered, his jaw tight with the kind of rigid authority that left no room for discussion. The other was slightly younger, his eyes darting between his partner and Brielle with a flicker of hesitation. She blinked, shifting her gaze between them. "Can I help you? We've received complaints about loitering in this area. I'm going to need to see some identification." Brielle frowned, glancing around. Families were sprawled across picnic blankets. Joggers passed by, earbuds in, lost in their own world. An elderly man fed pigeons near the fountain. "Loitering?" she repeated. "I'm sitting on a bench, reading a book." The older officer stiffened. "And I'm asking for identification." A slow, familiar anger coiled in her chest. She had seen this before. She had represented clients who had lived this before. The unnecessary stops, the vague accusations, the way some people had to prove they belonged in spaces that should have been for everyone. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Am I being detained?" The officer's jaw twitched. "You're obstructing an investigation." "Investigation into what?" she challenged. "You need to comply," the younger officer interjected, shifting uncomfortably. "Just show your ID, and we'll be on our way." A choice lay before her. She could reach into her bag, hand over her ID, and let them walk away, knowing they would never have stopped her if she had looked different. Or she could stand her ground, because if she didn't, who would? Brielle closed her book and stood, her heart pounding. "I know my rights. If I'm not being charged with anything, I'd like to continue my afternoon in peace." That was the moment everything shifted. The older officer's patience snapped. "Turn around," he ordered, stepping forward. Brielle barely had time to react before she felt his hand clamp around her wrist. Instinct kicked in. She jerked back, alarm flashing through her as she tried to pull away. "Stop resisting." A sharp pain exploded in her shoulder as she was forced forward, her book tumbling to the ground. People were watching now, mothers clutching their children, an older woman reaching for her phone. Someone shouted, but no one moved to intervene. The rough pavement bit into her palms as she was shoved to the ground. Her breath knocked from her lungs. Cold metal snapped around her wrists, and suddenly the world narrowed to the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." Brielle barely heard the words over the rush of anger, humiliation, and something deeper, something raw. She had spent years fighting for justice, and now she was being dragged away in broad daylight, as if she were nothing more than a criminal, as if she were invisible, as if she didn't belong. The last thing she saw before the doors of the police cruiser slammed shut was her book, pages fluttering in the wind, abandoned on the pavement. The air inside the precinct was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the faint, lingering traces of sweat and old coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, unforgiving glare over the gray cinder-block walls. The sounds of ringing phones, the shuffle of paperwork, and the occasional barked command from officers filled the space like background noise in a well-rehearsed machine. Brielle Hayes sat on a hard, metal bench in a cramped holding cell, her wrists aching from the too tight cuffs that had only just been removed. Her suit jacket was wrinkled, a streak of dirt smudged against the sleeve from when they had shoved her onto the pavement. She sat with her back straight, her chin slightly lifted, not defiant, not submissive, just composed. Control. It was the one thing she had left. The other women in the cell eyed her curiously, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and mild interest. Some sat slumped against the walls, arms crossed, eyes wary. A younger woman with braided hair and a defiant smirk chewed on a piece of gum, tapping her foot against the floor. "You look like you don't belong here," she finally said, tilting her head at Brielle. Brielle exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing." The girl chuckled, shaking her head. "Nah, you're too put together. You ain't like the rest of us." Brielle glanced around. A few of the women looked away, uninterested. One, an older woman in a hoodie, snorted under her breath. Brielle chose her next words, carefully. "We're all here for a reason." "Yeah, but some of us are here 'cause we're supposed to be," the girl said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And some of us? We're here 'cause somebody decided we should be." Brielle didn't respond. She didn't have to. The door at the end of the hallway buzzed open, and an officer stepped in. "Hayes," he called, glancing down at the clipboard in his hand. Brielle rose smoothly, ignoring the stares as she stepped toward the bars. The officer, young, freckled, barely older than a law student, avoided, looking her in the eye as he unlocked the cell. "You're being processed for booking," he muttered, gesturing for her to follow. Brielle stepped out, her heels clicking against the tile as she walked beside him. Her heart pounded, but she kept her breathing steady. She had walked through courtrooms filled with men who underestimated her. She had stood before judges who barely looked up when she spoke. This was no different. Except it was. Because this time, she wasn't walking in as an attorney. She was walking in as a defendant. The processing room was just as cold and impersonal as the rest of the precinct. A fingerprint scanner sat on a nearby desk, next to a row of neatly stacked ink pads. A camera was mounted on the wall, a black backdrop hanging behind it. "Stand here," another officer, this one older, his uniform slightly wrinkled, motioned to the small X taped to the floor in front of the camera. Brielle stepped into position, adjusting the sleeves of her blouse. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it show. The officer squinted at the screen, then looked at her. "Look straight ahead." The flash went off. For a brief moment, the image burned into her mind. Herself, framed in harsh lighting, expression blank, but eyes sharp. A woman who had spent her entire career defending others, now standing on the other side of the law. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so damn infuriating. Turn to the right. Another flash. Another piece of her dignity stripped away. After the mugshot came the fingerprinting. Brielle let them press her hands against the scanner, watching as her own prints appeared on the scrutiny. Distinct ridges that now existed in the system, like she was some common criminal. They led her to a desk where a man in a rumpled uniform sat typing, his fingers clacking against the keyboard with mechanical efficiency. He barely looked at her as he rattled off her charges. Obstruction of justice. Resisting arrest. Brielle inhaled slowly, forcing her hands to remain still in her lap. "Neither of which I did," she said evenly. The officer looked up for the first time, unimpressed. "You can take that up with the judge." "I intend to." He smirked slightly, as if she were just another case number, another annoyance in his shift. "Uh-huh. You have someone you want to call?" Brielle hesitated. The weight of the moment finally settled deep in her chest. She had spent years navigating the system, but she had never been in it like this. She had defended clients from situations just like this, had fought for them, had stood before judges demanding justice for them. Now, she was the one sitting in the chair, the one being processed like a statistic. And she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if she were not who she was, if she did not have the education, the legal knowledge, the resources, this moment could be the beginning of something much worse. She exhaled, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd like to make a call." The officer shoved the phone toward her. "Make it quick." Brielle took the receiver, dialed, and pressed it to her ear. The line rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered. "Brielle?" She closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. "I need you to get me out of here." Brielle Hayes sat in the dimly lit holding area, the cold from the metal bench seeping through her clothes. The receiver in her hand felt heavy. On the other end of the line, Elijah Maddox's voice carried the unmistakable edge of concern. "Brielle, what the hell happened?" Elijah had been her mentor since law school, a seasoned defense attorney with a sharp tongue and a reputation for dismantling prosecution cases with surgical precision. More importantly, he was one of the few people she trusted in this moment. Brielle took a steadying breath, her voice measured despite the fury simmering beneath her ribs. "I was arrested for sitting on a park bench." A beat of silence, then a sharp exhale. "They charged you with what?" "Obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." Elijah cursed under his breath. "You've got to be kidding me." "I wish I was." Her fingers tightened around the phone cord. "I need you to handle this." "They haven't read me my rights." No formal questioning. They moved straight to booking. "Of course they did," Elijah muttered. "Do you know the arresting officers?" Brielle's jaw tensed. She could still hear the snap of the cuffs, still feel the press of asphalt against her palms. "I didn't recognize them, but I'll remember their faces." Elijah was silent for a moment. Then, in a voice low and controlled, he said, "I'll have you out in the next few hours. Don't sign anything. Don't say anything else to them." "Got it?" "Got it." As she hung up the phone, Brielle caught the officer at the processing desk watching her. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her with mild interest. "You a lawyer?" he asked. Brielle didn't answer right away. The question wasn't innocent. He had been listening, picking up pieces of her conversation, trying to figure her out. Instead of answering, she met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "You tell me." The smirk that twitched at the corner of his mouth told her everything she needed to know. He was intrigued, but not intimidated. Not yet. Time dragged in the cell. Minutes felt like hours. The murmured conversations of other detainees faded into the background as Brielle focused on steadying her breathing. She had always known the system was flawed. She had spent years fighting within its walls, pushing against its biases, demanding better. But now, experiencing it firsthand, she understood the weight of it in a way that no amount of legal expertise could have prepared her for. This wasn't about justice. It was about power. A few hours later, the sound of footsteps approached. The officer from earlier stood at the bars, keys jangling in his hand. "Hayes, you made bail." Relief flickered through her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she stood with the same unshaken composure she had carried through the entire ordeal. As she stepped out of the cell, the officer leaned in slightly. "You must have friends in high places." Brielle met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No," she said, "I have the law." And with that, she walked past him, ready to fight the battle that had only just begun. The precinct doors swung open, and Brielle Hayes stepped into the cool night air. The city hummed around her headlights, slicing through the dark, distant sirens wailing. The chatter of people moving through the streets. But she didn't hear any of it. Her mind was locked onto one thing. This isn't over. Elijah Maddox was waiting just outside, leaning against a sleek black sedan, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, but the deep furrow between his brows made it clear that he was pissed. "You all right?" His voice was low, controlled. Brielle rolled her shoulders, exhaling slowly. I've had better days. Elijah's eyes scanned her, as if assessing whether she was truly okay or just putting on a front. You sure you didn't throw a punch or curse someone out? Brielle let out a humorless chuckle. No, I was reading a book. That was my crime. His face darkened. They didn't just want to arrest you, Brielle. They wanted to put you in the system. You know what happens if this sticks? They'll use it to discredit everything you've ever worked for. She knew. Of course she knew. The second those officers had slammed her onto the ground, she had seen the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her, it was about sending a message. They underestimated me, she said quietly. Elijah studied her for a beat, then nodded toward the car. Come on, let's get you home. Tomorrow, we go to war. The next morning, Brielle's phone was vibrating nonstop. Calls, texts, news alerts. Elijah had wasted no time. He had contacted the right people. And now, her arrest wasn't just a footnote in the system. It was a headline. Attorney Brielle Hayes, arrested in public park, wrongfully detained, or justified action. Prominent civil rights lawyer, booked on charges of obstruction legal community, demands answers. Body cam footage raises questions in high-profile arrest. Brielle scrolled through the articles, feeling the shift happening in real time. The body cam footage hadn't been released yet, but witnesses had spoken out. The officers had no idea who she was when they arrested her. And now that they did, the department was scrambling. A knock at her apartment door snapped her out of her thoughts. Elijah walked in, tossing a folder onto the table. They're in damage control mode. The department put out a vague statement about standard procedure and pending internal review. He snorted. Translation, they're stalling until they figure out if they can bury this. Brielle flipped open the folder. Inside were statements from witnesses, legal documents, and the preliminary filings for a civil suit. I'm not just fighting for me, she said, skimming the pages. I want this case to mean something. Elijah nodded. Then we make sure they regret ever putting cuffs on you. Brielle clenched her jaw, her pulse steady, her mind clear. She had fought for justice her entire career. Now, she was fighting for herself, and she wasn't about to lose. The courtroom was packed. Brielle Hayes sat at the defense table, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was no stranger to these rooms, the high ceilings, the polished wood, the weight of the law hanging in the air like a storm cloud. But today, she wasn't standing as an attorney. She was the accused. Across from her, the prosecution was already shifting uncomfortably. The DA assigned to the case a smug-looking man in his late 40s, named Jacob Harrington, had probably expected this to be an easy conviction, a quick case, an open and shut win. But he hadn't counted on her, and he certainly hadn't counted on what was about to happen next. Elijah Maddox, standing beside her, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit new evidence into the record. Judge Lorraine Carter raised a sharp eyebrow. New evidence? This is a preliminary hearing, counselor. You know the rules. Elijah smiled slightly, as if he had been expecting that response. Respectfully, Your Honor, the prosecution built their case on the claim that my client resisted arrest, that she obstructed officers. We're submitting body cam footage that tells a very different story. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Brielle kept her expression neutral, but inside, she felt the air shift. This was it. Harrington sat forward, his jaw tightening. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's also highly relevant. Elijah cut in smoothly. Unless, of course, the prosecution is objecting to the truth being shown in court. Judge Carter exhaled through her nose, then nodded. I'll allow it. Play the footage. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the bailiff set up the screen. A moment later, the video began. It was all there clear as day. Brielle sitting on the bench, a book in her lap. The officers approaching her, questioning her without cause. Her calm, measured voice asking if she was being detained. The moment they grabbed her, wrenched her arms behind her back. The way she didn't fight, didn't resist. The way they forced her down anyway. The sound of her head hitting the pavement. The gasps in the courtroom were almost deafening. Judge Carter's expression remained unreadable, but the slight narrowing of her eyes told Brielle everything she needed to know. Harrington shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly cracking. "Your Honor, this doesn't." Judge Carter held up a hand. "Enough." She turned toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Harrington, would you like to explain why this footage was not submitted by your office?" Harrington's mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. That's what Brielle thought. She glanced sideways at Elijah, and for the first time in days, a small smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. They had just flipped the game on its head, and the other side had no idea what to do next. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brielle didn't move, didn't blink. She wanted to soak in every second of the prosecution's unraveling. Judge Carter's stare drilled into Harrington like a blade. "I asked you a question, counselor. Why wasn't this footage turned over to the defense?" Harrington cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "Your Honor, the footage was still under review by the department. We were awaiting a full assessment before." "Before what?" Elijah interjected, his voice dangerously smooth. "Before it exposed the truth. Before it proved that my client was the victim, not the criminal." A fresh round of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled notes. A few people shook their heads in disbelief. The weight of the moment was sinking in. Judge Carter's gaze flicked between the two lawyers before she spoke again. "Mr. Maddox, do you intend to pursue a Brady violation?" Elijah clasped his hands together, feigning innocence. "Well, Your Honor, if the prosecution intentionally withheld exculpatory evidence, that would be a clear violation of my client's rights. And if that's the case, we would be well within our rights to demand a full investigation into the DA's office and its handling of this case." Harrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what that meant. If the court determined that the prosecution had deliberately concealed evidence that could exonerate Brielle, not only would the charges be dismissed, but his career could take a serious hit. Judge Carter exhaled sharply, tapping a manicured nail against her desk. "Mr. Harrington, the first suggest you get your house in order. Effective immediately, this court is requesting a full review of all evidence in this case. Any further discovery violations will not be tolerated." Brielle could see the small flicker of defeat in Harrington's eyes. He had lost control of the narrative. She turned slightly, just enough to glance toward the prosecution side of the courtroom, where two uniformed officers sat rigidly in their seats. The same officers who had arrested her. They were shifting now, glancing at each other. The carefully crafted arrogance they had carried in the precinct was nowhere to be found. Good. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure they never did this to someone else. Judge Carter straightened. "Given this new evidence, the court is granting the defense's motion for an evidentiary hearing. We will reconvene in 72 hours. She turned to Elijah. "In the meantime, Mr. Maddox, I trust you'll have additional filings prepared." Elijah's grin was razor-sharp. "You can count on it." The gavel struck. Court adjourned. The moment Brielle and Elijah stepped into the courthouse hallway, the press swarmed. "Attorney Hayes, do you believe the police department deliberately targeted you?" "Elijah Maddox, will you be filing a civil rights lawsuit?" "Brielle, what's your message to the community after today's hearing?" Brielle held up a hand, silencing the questions. She looked directly into the cameras, her voice unwavering. "My message?" She let the pause linger, making sure they were listening. "This isn't just about me. This is about accountability. This is about every person who has been silenced, who has been mistreated, who has been told that their rights don't matter. Today, we took one step toward justice, but we're not done yet." Flashes went off. The questions came faster, but Brielle didn't say another word. She had already said enough. Now, she was going to show them. The courthouse emptied slowly, people lingering in the halls to whisper about what had just happened. The air outside was thick with humidity, but Brielle barely noticed. Her mind was still in the courtroom, replaying every detail, every crack in the prosecution's case, every flicker of fear she had seen in those officers' eyes. Elijah walked beside her, scanning the sidewalk where reporters still hovered, hoping for another statement. "We should move," he muttered, nodding toward the street. "Press isn't gonna let up anytime soon." Brielle exhaled through her nose. Let them wait. She had more important things to do than feed the media frenzy. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and a young woman in a crisp gray suit stepped out. Tamara Colleone, of the sharpest investigative journalists in the city. "Miss Hayes," Tamara called, striding toward them. "Give me 2 minutes." Elijah tensed. She's not giving any more statements. Tamara didn't even glance at him. Her gaze was locked on Brielle. "I'm not here for a quote. I'm here to show you something." Brielle studied her for a beat, then nodded. "Walk with me." They moved down the sidewalk, just far enough from the crowd to avoid being overheard. Tamara pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. "I got a tip last night. Someone inside the department leaked these to me." She turned the phone around. Brielle's stomach tightened. It was an email chain between the officers who had arrested her. "We should make sure she doesn't slip through the cracks. If she wants to act like she's untouchable, we can remind her who's really in charge." Brielle's hands curled into fists. She swiped to the next image. A report marked internal review, with a timestamp from the night she had been arrested. She read the highlighted section. "Due to her public profile, the situation will be handled internally. Officers involved are advised to refrain from discussing the incident further." Brielle's pulse roared in her ears. Tamara lowered the phone. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they thought they could bury it. Elijah leaned in, reading over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. This is proof of intent. They didn't just act on impulse. They planned it. Brielle forced herself to take a steady breath. Anger wouldn't help her now. She needed to be smart. "I need copies," she said. "Everything you have." Tamara nodded. "Already sent them to your email." Brielle met her gaze. "You're running this story?" "Tomorrow morning." A flicker of a smile. "Front page." Brielle nodded, her mind already working ahead. Tomorrow, the whole city would know the truth. And after that, she would make damn sure no one forgot it. The storm hit at dawn. By the time Brielle stepped out of her apartment that morning, the city was already awake with the fallout. Her phone had been vibrating non-stop calls, texts, emails. Everyone had seen Tamara Cole's article. The leaked emails. The proof that her arrest had been planned. The truth was no longer contained within the courtroom. It was on every news station, every social media feed. And now, there was nowhere for the police department to hide. Elijah was already waiting for her outside, dressed sharply as always, but his usual smirk was gone. He handed her a coffee without a word. She took a sip before speaking. "How bad is it?" He exhaled, glancing at his phone. "Depends on who you ask. Half the city is calling for the officers to be fired. The other half," he hesitated, "they're calling you a liar, saying this is just another attack on law enforcement." Brielle had expected that. The truth didn't set everyone free sometimes. It just made them angrier. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. It wasn't Tamara this time. It was them. 2 uniformed officers stepped out. Not the ones who had arrested her, no. Those men were nowhere to be found today. These officers were higher up. Clean-cut, corporate, damage control. The taller one, a man with graying hair and a tight jawline, stepped forward. "Miss Hayes, I'm Captain James Caldwell with Internal Affairs. We'd like to have a word." Brielle set her coffee down on the hood of Elijah's car. If you want to talk, you can do it in court. Or better yet, on the record. Caldwell's expression remained unreadable. No lawyers. No reporters. Just a conversation. Elijah stepped in, his voice sharp. She's got nothing to say to you. Caldwell's gaze flicked to Elijah, then back to Brielle. This isn't going away quietly. You know that. Brielle didn't flinch. Good. Caldwell sighed, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a folded envelope and handed it to her. Consider this a courtesy. She took it, but didn't open it. The SUV door shut behind them, and just like that, they were gone. Elijah frowned. What the hell is that? Brielle unfolded the paper and scanned the words. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't a threat. It was a subpoena. The city wasn't just watching anymore. The system was fighting back. Brielle's fingers tightened around the subpoena. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the words on it carried something far more dangerous than ink. Elijah read over her shoulder, his lips pressing into a thin line. They're calling you before a grand jury? She didn't answer immediately. Her mind was already working, breaking down the angles, the implications. A grand jury meant they weren't just trying to sweep this under the rug. They were preparing to fight back, to use the legal system against her, just like they had done the night of her arrest. Elijah shook his head, muttering under his breath. This is retaliation. Brielle finally spoke, her voice steady. Of course it is. She folded the subpoena and slipped it into her bag. If they thought this was going to scare her, they had seriously underestimated her resolve. Elijah exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. All right, we need to get ahead of this. First, we call Tamara. If they're dragging you in, the public needs to know it's a power play, not justice. Then we. No. Brielle cut him off. Elijah blinked. No? She turned to him fully. They want to turn this into a spectacle. If we go straight to the press, we play into their hands. Let them make the first move. He crossed his arms. And what if that first move is charging you with something? Brielle's jaw clenched. Then we make damn sure it backfires. She could already see the strategy unfolding in her mind. They wanted to paint her as a troublemaker, a radical who was trying to tear down the system. But the system had already been exposed. People had seen the leaked emails, heard the lies unravel in court. If the police department thought they could regain control by putting her on trial, they were in for a brutal wake-up call. Elijah studied her, then sighed. You're not going to let me talk you out of this, are you? She gave him a small, humorless smile. When have you ever been able to? He huffed out a laugh, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Fine, but I want my entire legal team on standby. And you will let me handle the media when the time comes. Brielle nodded, and for now, that was enough. The calm before the storm, Brielle spent the next few hours in her office, preparing. She pored over every document, every angle of her case. She knew how this worked. A grand jury proceeding wasn't a trial, it was an investigation, one controlled almost entirely by the prosecution. There would be no defense attorneys in the room, no chance for cross-examination. Just her, the evidence they chose to present, and a jury that could be swayed by rhetoric as much as fact. She had to be ready. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Check your email. Her pulse quickened. She opened her inbox and found a single new email with no subject line. The attachment was a scanned document, official, sealed and stamped by the police department. She clicked it open. Her breath caught. It was a report, one that had never been filed in court, a report that should have been included in the evidence against her. Internal review summary, officer misconduct allegation, incident, arrest of Brielle Hayes, August 17. Summary. Initial review of arrest procedure raises concerns regarding use of force and failure to follow protocol. Pending further investigation, officers advised to limit public discussion of the case. It was a smoking gun. The department had known from the start that her arrest was flawed. They had documented it, but instead of following through, they had buried it, hoping no one would ever find out. Brielle's grip on her phone tightened. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a system that had been willing to protect corruption at all costs. And now, she had the proof to burn it all down. She grabbed her bag, dialed Elijah, and headed for the courthouse. It was time to go to war. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade bathed in the afternoon sun. It was a place built to uphold justice, but Brielle had learned the hard way that justice here was not blind. It had a pulse, an agenda, a carefully curated list of who deserved fairness and who didn't. And today, she was about to walk straight into the lion's den. Elijah was already waiting for her at the steps, his phone glued to his ear. He was pacing, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The moment he spotted her, he ended the call and strode toward her. "Tell me you're not actually going in there alone," he said, his voice tight with frustration. Brielle pulled the printed copy of the leaked internal report from her bag and held it up. "Tell me you've ever known me to back down when I have evidence like this in my hands." He blew out a breath, glancing around. The courthouse plaza wasn't crowded yet, but she could see reporters lingering, watching, waiting for something to happen. "I don't like this," Elijah admitted. "You're walking into their trap." Brielle tilted her head. "Or maybe they're walking into mine." Before he could argue further, the courthouse doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped out: Assistant District Attorney Neil Harrington and another prosecutor Brielle didn't recognize. Harrington's face was unreadable, but she knew he was here for a reason. He didn't waste time on formalities. "Miss Hayes, we need to talk. Privately." Brielle crossed her arms. "If you want to talk, you can do it in front of my attorney." Harrington's jaw ticked, but he nodded. "Fine. Follow me." Brielle exchanged a glance with Elijah before walking inside. The room was smaller than she expected. No courtroom, no audience. Just a plain conference room with a long wooden table and blinds drawn over the windows. Harrington took a seat across from her, his expression carefully controlled. Elijah sat beside her, arms crossed, his presence a silent warning. "Let's get to it," Brielle said. Harrington leaned forward, folding his hands. "You've been subpoenaed as part of a grand jury investigation. You know what that means, correct?" She gave him a humorless smile. "It means you're looking for a way to flip the script." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "It means we're investigating the events surrounding your arrest, including all actions taken by both you and the officers involved." Brielle's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. "And by all actions, you mean you're trying to build a case against me instead of the officers who actually broke the law?" Harrington didn't deny it. Instead, he slid a folder across the table. "We have evidence that could lead to obstruction charges against you. We also have grounds for perjury if your testimony before the grand jury contradicts any statements you've previously given." Elijah tensed beside her. "This is bullshit, and you know it." Harrington ignored him. His gaze was locked onto Brielle. "We can fight this out in court, drag it through the media, let it become another circus. Or," he paused, watching her reaction, "you can walk away. Drop the case. We'll make sure the officers involved are disciplined quietly, and you can move on with your career." Brielle stared at him. She could almost laugh at the audacity. He was offering her an easy exit, a chance to step away before things got ugly. And maybe, for someone else, it would have been tempting. She had worked too hard to build her reputation, to earn her seat at the table. The idea of risking all of that, of letting them drag her through the mud just to protect their own, was infuriating. But she also knew exactly what would happen if she said yes. They would sweep everything under the rug. The officers would get a slap on the wrist. The public would move on, and nothing would change. No, she wasn't here to make things easier for them. She was here to win. Brielle leaned forward, meeting Harrington's gaze. "You're afraid." He blinked. Excuse me, you wouldn't be offering me a deal if you weren't worried about what I might say under oath. You know this grand jury isn't about finding the truth, it's about protecting the system. And you're scared that I'll rip it apart in front of everyone watching. Harrington's face darkened. You think this will end my career? She continued, voice steady. Maybe it will. Maybe you'll drag me through the dirt and try to ruin me. But here's what you don't understand. I don't care. I don't care about my name in the legal world, or the connections I might lose, or the doors that might close. Because this fight is bigger than me. And you should be afraid. Because no matter how hard you try to bury this, I will not let you win. The silence in the room was suffocating. Elijah smirked. So, I guess that's a no to your little deal. Harrington's jaw tightened. He exhaled sharply, then stood, straightening his suit. Fine. Have it your way. As he turned to leave, Brielle called out, You should read the news tomorrow morning, Harrington. He glanced back, frowning. Brielle smiled. Something tells me you won't like the headline. The moment they stepped outside, Elijah let out a low whistle. I hope you know what you just did in there. Brielle exhaled, feeling the weight of the confrontation settle into her bones. I do. She knew what was coming. The city was about to become a battlefield. The police department, the DA's office, the entire justice system, they would throw everything they had at her to keep their secrets buried. But they had underestimated something. Brielle Hayes had nothing left to lose. And that made her the most dangerous person in the room. The courthouse steps were no longer just stone and concrete, they had become a battlefield. By the time Brielle exited the building, a storm had already begun to gather. Not in the sky, but in the faces of the reporters waiting for her, in the chants of protesters lining the streets, in the burning fury behind every camera lens pointed in her direction. Her refusal to back down had made waves. And now, those waves were turning into a tsunami. Elijah walked beside her, his expression unreadable. They're waiting for you to say something, he murmured. Are you ready for this? Brielle tightened her grip on the folder in her hand. Inside was everything proof of the cover-ups, the internal reports that exposed the misconduct, the leaked memos that showed just how deep the corruption ran. She had spent years believing in the law, in the system she had sworn to serve. And yet, standing here now, she understood the truth. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. And that was the real problem. She stepped forward, her heartbeat steady. The cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust toward her, voices overlapping in a desperate bid for her attention. Miss Hayes, do you have any comment on the DA's threats against you? Are you planning to testify, despite the allegations of obstruction? What do you say to those who claim you're trying to start a war with law enforcement? She raised a hand, and miraculously, the chaos quieted. Brielle took a slow breath before she spoke. I was arrested for sitting in a park. I was charged for refusing to accept mistreatment. And when I fought back, they tried to destroy me. She held up the folder. But here's what they didn't count on me fighting smarter. The reporters leaned in. The crowd held its breath. In this folder is proof that the officers involved in my arrest were part of a larger cover-up. They were protected, shielded, and encouraged by a system that sees accountability as an inconvenience. I have documents. I have testimonies. I have receipts. And I am not afraid to use them. Elijah exhaled beside her. The reporters erupted into questions. The protesters cheered. And in that moment, Brielle knew this was bigger than just her case now. This was war. By nightfall, Brielle's name was everywhere. News anchors dissected her statement. Social media exploded with the hashtag Justice for Brielle. Protesters filled the streets, demanding action. The DA's office released a panicked statement, denying allegations, but the damage was done. And then, the first real blow landed. An anonymous source leaked additional documents to the press, more proof of systemic corruption. More names tied to the scandal. It wasn't just about Brielle anymore. It was about dozens of cases swept under the rug, about a system that had been feeding on injustice for years. It was about power. And now, that power was slipping. 3 nights later, Brielle found herself in a different kind of battle. The parking garage was dimly lit, her footsteps echoing against the concrete. Elijah had warned her not to go alone, but she had insisted. The message she had received was too important. When she reached the farthest corner, a shadow stepped forward. Detective Marcus Langley, one of the few good cops left. "You have to stop," he said, voice low. "You don't understand what you're up against." Brielle crossed her arms. "Oh, I think I do." Langley glanced around nervously. "This isn't just about a few bad officers. There are people with real power protecting them. People who don't play fair." She could hear it in his voice, fear. And yet, she didn't flinch. "Then they should be afraid of me too," she said. Langley exhaled sharply. "If you keep pushing, they'll come after you." She already knew that. She had already decided it didn't matter. Brielle took a step closer. "The only way they win is if I stop. And I am not stopping." Langley studied her, then slowly nodded. "Then let's burn them down." And just like that, the war officially began. Brielle had always believed that justice, though slow, was inevitable. She wasn't so sure anymore. For days, the city had been on fire, not with flames, but with something more powerful. Protests grew larger. More officers were implicated. Public officials scrambled to do damage control, but the truth had already spread too far. Every news station ran her story. Every journalist with a spine was digging deeper. And then the threats started. At first, it was just whisper anonymous calls, emails full of vague warnings. But then it escalated. Her car tires were slashed. A brick smashed through her apartment window. A man in an unmarked car followed her home. The system wasn't just defending itself. It was fighting back. Elijah was the one who found her that night, sitting in the darkness of her apartment, staring at the broken glass on her floor. "You need to get out of here," he said. "Just for a little while. Lay low." Brielle let out a short laugh, sharp, bitter. "And then what? Let them win?" He knelt in front of her, gripping her hands. "No. You let them think they're winning. You're no good to this fight if you're dead, Brielle." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the exhaustion in his face, the worry in his eyes. He had been by her side through all of this, and now he was afraid, not for himself, but for her. "Elijah," her voice wavered. "Please," he whispered. She exhaled slowly. "Okay." She should have known it wouldn't be that easy. Brielle packed a small bag and left in the dead of night. She was supposed to stay at a safe house, a quiet place outside the city. But as she drove through the nearly empty streets, a pair of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. Then another, and another. Her pulse quickened. The road ahead was deserted, no witnesses. The perfect place for an accident. They were coming for her. Brielle tightened her grip on the wheel. She didn't have a weapon, didn't have a plan, but she had her mind. And she wasn't going down without a fight. Her foot slammed the gas pedal. The car roared forward. Behind her, the headlights sped up. She wasn't running. She was leading them straight into a trap of her own. Brielle's car tore through the empty streets, tires screeching, as she took a hard left. The headlights behind her followed instantly, closing in. They weren't just trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to end this. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. Fear was useless now. Panic would get her killed. Her eyes darted to the dashboard, half a tank of gas. She could keep them on the road for a while, but she needed more than just speed. She needed a plan. Then she saw it. The underpass ahead, arc, isolated, with only one exit. Perfect. She gripped the wheel, took a sharp turn, and gunned it straight for the tunnel. The moment she hit the darkness, she slammed the brakes. The pursuing cars didn't have time to react. One shot passed her completely, unable to stop in time. Another swerved hard to avoid collision. The third skidded to a halt, just inches from her rear bumper. For a split second, everything was still. Then Brielle threw open her door. She was moving before they could process what had happened. The driver of the nearest car stepped out big, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who thought his size alone could intimidate. He wasn't expecting her to move first. Brielle drove her knee up into his stomach, grabbed his wrist, and twisted just like her father had taught her years ago. He let out a grunt of pain as she ripped the gun from his holster and turned it on the others. "Step out," she ordered. Silence. Then, slowly, two more men emerged from the second car. The third vehicle had disappeared, speeding off into the night. Someone was cutting their losses. "Hands where I can see them," she demanded. The taller of the two chuckled. "You're not gonna shoot us, Hayes. You're a lawyer, not a killer." She smirked, leveling the gun at his knee. "Then I guess you don't need both legs." The amusement faded from his face. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Brielle exhaled, steadying her grip on the gun. "You boys really should have picked a better night." Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights flooded the tunnel. Police vehicles swarmed the scene. But for once, Brielle wasn't afraid. She had set the trap, and they had walked right into it. By morning, the news had already broken. The men who had tried to run Brielle off the road, off-duty officers, connected directly to the corruption scandal. The third Karth one that got away had been traced back to a high-ranking city official. The system had overplayed its hand, and now it was burning down. Elijah found her in the courthouse later that day, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. "You did it," he said, almost in disbelief. Brielle gave a tired smile. "Not yet. But we're close." He exhaled. "So what now?" She looked past him, through the courthouse doors, where protesters still gathered, where cameras still flashed. Then she turned back to him, fire in her eyes. "Now?" She adjusted her blazer, standing taller. "Now, we finish this." Brielle's fight wasn't just about her. It was about all the voices that had been silenced, all the people who had been told that justice wasn't for them. She refused to accept that. She stood her ground, and in doing so, she ignited something bigger than herself, a movement, a reckoning, a demand for real change. This story is a reminder that corruption thrives when good people stay silent. But when one person dares to speak up, they give others the courage to do the same. Justice isn't given. It's fought for. And it starts with you. If this story moved you, don't just stop here. Like this video to spread awareness. Comment your thoughts. What would you do in Brielle's situation? Share this story with your friends and family. Change starts with a conversation. Subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the truth. Together, we can shine a light on injustice. Together, we can make a difference.